In my presentation, I would like to go back to a more basic or maybe fundamental question of what the role of national parliaments in EU politics actually is. The role of national parliaments has gained increased attention over the last, say, 10, 20 years, but there is still no consensus either within political practice nor within academia on whether they, and we've heard this before, are losers or latecomers of the process, or whether they might by now have developed into more powerful players. And I believe that one of the reasons is that we still are very unclear about what their role actually is. So much of the debate, especially in academia, centers on the so-called De-Parliamentarisation thesis. And you all know the standard diagnosis, which means that the process of European integration has weakened national parliaments by transferring large areas of domestic policy making to the EU level. So the result is the loss of legislative competencies and therefore policy making power for national parliaments who have no direct control over policy making at the European level. That's the standard diagnosis. And in this short presentation, I want to argue that this diagnosis is flawed, not because this is so much wrong, but mainly because it is incomplete. And the problem I see it is that it focuses almost exclusively on the legislative or the policy-making functions of national parliaments, while other functions that parliaments have, and that I believe are as or even more important than policy making, simply fall under the radar, and as a result, the proposed therapies remain insufficient as well. Instead, I will argue that it is in fact the communication function of national parliaments that is at least, if not more important than the policy-making function in EU affairs, and that this is actually the case for parliaments in general, and that EU affairs is not so special in this regard. And finally, to sum up the argument, I want to look at how parliaments have actually fulfilled their communication function in EU affairs over the last few years. So let's first turn to the standard diagnosis, which sees MPs as suffering from the loss of legislative competencies and controls. And we can find two standard therapies to deal with this problem. On the one hand, we have scholars who have given up on the patient, who've decided that national parliaments are never able to compete with national executives or their national governments in EU affairs, and therefore propose to let the patient die and to look for democratic legitimation elsewhere. There's a second therapy, which we can see in EU affairs in particular, which tries to cure the loss of policy or legislative competencies by the injection of co-decision rights for national parliaments. And we can see this both at the national level, for example, with the introduction of tighter mandating rights for national parliaments, but also more recently at the European level, where national parliaments were given a collective, let's say, participation right, at least via the early warning system, for example. However, I am rather skeptical about the therapeutic success of strengthening parliamentary decision rights in EU affairs. We all know that in EU politics, national parliaments are what Arthur Benz has called external veto players. So they are players that may, under certain circumstances, possibly prevent a decision at the European level, but they have no direct impact at the EU level in the negotiations because they are not directly involved. So even the strongest parliament can only influence EU decisions indirectly through their national representative in the council, who in turn, let's not forget that, has to negotiate with 27 other partners in the council. And this does not even include the multitude of other actors and institutions at the European level who are involved in EU decision making. So even if we give national parliaments very, very strong mandating rights, and they actually do use these rights, I think we can still expect the actual impact of national parliaments, of single national parliaments on EU policy making in the end to be rather negligible. So does that mean that the proponents of the de-parliamentarisation thesis are right and that there is no cure and maybe we should let the patient die and look elsewhere for democratic legitimacy? I would actually say exactly the opposite is the case. National parliaments have a very vital role in EU politics, and they can make a very, very important contribution to the democratic legitimacy of the EU. To quote John Stuart Mill, instead of the function of governing, for which it is radically unfit, the proper office of a representative assembly is to be an organ for popular demands and a place of adverse discussion for all opinions in relation to public matters, both great and small. So one of the main functions of parliaments as democratic representatives is the communication function. And this communication function for me is especially important in EU politics, where it is the opacity of decision-making processes and the lack of accountability of actors involved in decision-making that have been defined as the core elements of the democratic deficit. Democracy as government by and for the people not only means that the people choose their representatives, but also that democratic representatives, and that of course includes parliamentarians, are expected to be responsive and act in the best interest of those represented. Question is, of course, how do we define what the best interest is? Especially given that citizens usually have so many different and sometimes even conflicting interests. Beauty, they say, lies in the eyes of the beholder, and the same is of course true for the judgment of whether our representatives have indeed acted in our best interest. Democracy is based on the fundamental principle that it is the people who get to judge whether the representatives have represented them in a way they approve of, and to hold them accountable for it if not. However, in order to make and to hold their representatives accountable, policies, alternatives, solutions, and problems need to be communicated. Such a right to justification also follows from the second fundamental principle of equality as a cornerstone of democracy. Given that citizens have conflicting interests and different interests, they will also not all enjoy equality in terms of a realization of their interests. But they must all have an equal right for a justification of why their interests were put aside. And these fundamental aspects of democracy that make communication so incredibly important, which is why Esaison and Auel have called responsiveness the promise of communication. It is not the promise of interest realization, it is the promise of communicating why decisions were taken and others not. This is what makes it so important, and that is also true in EU affairs. So let me quickly have a look at how parliaments actually do fulfill their communication function in EU affairs. And I'm drawing on data that was collected for all national parliaments in the EU between 2010 and 2012 by the OPAR project. In the first figure, I would like to compare the hours spent by national parliaments on EU issues in the plenary and on EU issues in the European Affairs Committees. And as you can see, in most parliaments, EU affairs are very firmly delegated to the committees. There are a few parliaments, which includes, for example, Finland, Germany, but also Italy and especially the Netherlands, where we can see a far higher proportion of European activities in the plenary. What the figure does not show you is that these parliaments have all decentralized EU affairs to the standing committees, and due to data access, we were not able to take that into account. So even in these parliaments, the ratio between committee time and plenary time will be far less favorable in reality. So let's have a quick look at the percentage of time spent debating in the plenary. How much of that is actually spent on debating EU issues? And as you can see, there are only 3 parliaments in the EU, and I'm talking about the lower houses only, that reach a percentage above 10%. This is Austria, Finland, and Germany. All of the others remain below 10%, and quite a few remain below 4%. And please remember that this is during a time of crisis in the EU, the time of the eurozone crisis. So you can see how much of those debates were spent on debating eurozone crisis issues and how many of them were spent on debating other EU issues. And you can see how big the impact on the debating activity of the crisis was. So the crisis did trigger some kind of politicization and some greater communication, but should also not be overestimated. So even under a time of crisis, over average, parliaments devote 5% of their plenary time to debating EU issues, even during the time of a proper crisis where EU issues have become very politicized and take up a lot of room. So to come back to the argument at the beginning, de-parliamentarisation, from this point of view, if you consider how important parliamentary communication is to democratic politics, then de-parliamentarisation not only means the loss of policy-making competencies, it also means that parliaments no longer provide or fulfill their communication function simply because specific issues are now no longer decided within the domestic arena, but at the European arena. So thereby removing these issues from domestic parliamentary debate and public party competition, which also means that it is not only the evil shadow of the EU that weakens national parliaments, but it also means that quite a substantial part of the EU democratic deficit is homemade. Thank you.